continues. We will continue to work for justice at home, including justice for the victims of violent crime. I appreciate John Ashcroft's leadership, his stand on principle, and his wise counsel during my time as the president. I appreciate so very much Senator Feinstein and Senator Kyle carrying this cause that I'm here to support. I want to thank the chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee for coming as well, Senator Leahy and Senator Hatch. I want to thank all the members from the United States Congress for being here. Congressman Barrett and Shabbat and Wicker. I too want to thank John Walsh. I appreciate not only you standing up for victims, I appreciate you putting the pictures of the Al-Qaeda killers on the TV screen to help America remain alert, to help this country understand that we're still endangered from attack. I want to thank you for being a good American, and I want to thank you for helping the cause. I want to welcome the leaders of victim rights groups from all around the country. I particularly want to thank and congratulate those who are award winners today. As John mentioned, in the year 2000, Americans were victims of millions of crimes. Behind each of these numbers is a terrible trauma, a story of suffering, and a story of lost security. Yet the needs of victims are often an afterthought in our criminal justice system. It's not just, it's not fair, and it must change. As we protect the rights of criminals, we must take equal care to protect the rights of the victims. Many of the victims of crime have gotten a crash course in the complications and frustrations of our criminal justice system. One victim put it this way: they explained the defendant's constitutional right to the nth degree. They couldn't do this and they couldn't do that because of his constitutional rights. And I wondered what mine were. And they told me I hadn't got any. Guy sounded like he came from Texas. But too often our system fails to inform victims about proceedings involving bail and pleas and sentencing, and even about the trials themselves. Too often the process fails to take the safety of victims into account when deciding whether to release dangerous offenders. Too often the financial losses of victims are ignored. And too often victims are not allowed to address the court at sentencing and explain their suffering, or even to be present in the courtroom where their victimizers are being tried. When our criminal justice systems treats victims as irrelevant bystanders, they are victimized for a second time. And because Americans are justifiably proud of our system and expect it to treat us fairly, the second violation of our rights can be traumatic. It's like a huge slap, said one victim, because you think the system will protect you. It's maddening and frightening. 30 years ago, a grassroots movement began to stand up for the rights of victims. It resulted in domestic violence shelters, support groups for families of homicide victims, rape crisis centers. They exist in cities and neighborhoods all across America because Americans care about their neighbors in need. One good example is in John's home state of Missouri. It's called Aid for Victims of Crime, Inc., in which volunteers provide counseling and court advocacy and other essential services to the victims of crime. Victims' rights groups are active every single day. There isn't a day that goes by that they're not involved in somebody's life. And they're especially important during times of disaster and crisis. You know, when the bomber hit Oklahoma City, victims' rights groups were on the scene immediately thereafter to help. And the same happened after 9/11 in New York and Washington, Pennsylvania. Victims' rights groups were there. Hundreds of counselors and chaplains and social workers, victim service providers helped their fellow Americans deal with the unspeakable pain and suffering caused by the terrorist murders. The Attorney General will shortly present awards to outstanding individuals and groups for their work on behalf of victims. I had the honor of meeting the winners, and I want to congratulate them publicly for loving your neighbor just like you'd like to be loved yourself. You've chosen to live out the words of St. Paul. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. And as our nation struggles to overcome the evil of September the 11th, your lives, the example you set, stand out as models of compassion and integrity. The victims' rights movement has touched the conscience of this country, and our criminal justice system has begun to respond, treating victims with greater respect. The states, as well as the federal government, have passed legal protections for victims. However, those laws are insufficient to fully recognize the rights of crime victims. Victims of violent crime have important rights that deserve protection in our Constitution. So today I announce my support for the bipartisan Crime Victims' Rights Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. As I mentioned, this amendment is sponsored by Senator Feinstein of California, Senator Kyle of Arizona. One a Democrat, one a Republican, both great Americans. This amendment makes some basic pledges to Americans. Victims of violent crime deserve the right to be notified of public proceedings involving the crime. They deserve to be heard at public proceedings regarding the criminal sentence or potential release. They deserve to have their safety considered. They deserve consideration of their claims of restitution. We must guarantee these rights for all the victims of violent crime in America. The Feinstein-Kyle Amendment was written with care and strikes a proper balance. Our legal system properly protects the rights of the accused in the Constitution, but it does not provide similar protection for the rights of victims, and that must change. The protection of victims' rights is one of those rare instances when amending the Constitution is the right thing to do. And the Feinstein-Kyle Crime Victims' Rights Amendment is the right way to do it. May God bless you all, and may God bless America.
President Bush there, the Justice Department, with the Attorney General John Ashcroft, who's just announced his support for the bipartisan Crime Victims' Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. This amendment, this bipartisan amendment, would provide that victims have the right to be notified of any public proceedings regarding any crime that they were involved in. That would include the sentencing of anyone convicted of the crime, and as well as the release of that person. Should that person be released from jail, the victims have the right to be notified if whoever perpetrated the crime against them is going to be released. It also provides for the safety of the victims, as well as any claims of restitution a victim may have. He says, President Bush here said this morning that we must guarantee these rights to all victims of violent crime. The Constitution rightly provides protections for those who are accused of crime. It's time to do the same for those who are victims of crime. John Walsh of America's Most Wanted. We've seen him quite a bit here on our network. He's going to be back on our network with Wolf Blitzer coming up at 5 p.m. Eastern, and we'll talk about that during that show. Darren, over to you.
Meanwhile, I want to listen in to Barbara Morgan. She now plans to be the first teacher in space. She's